In a quiet corner of northeastern Pennsylvania, a man lies buried beneath two granite statues and a mound of red Oklahoma soil. He never visited this town, he never lived in this state, he had no connection to it. Not a friend, not a memory, not a single footprint. His body was brought here as part of a deal, traded for the promise of a monument and a new name on a welcome sign. His name was Jim Thorpe, and the story of how the greatest athlete in American history ended up in a grave 700 miles from home is one of the most extraordinary and devastating stories in the history of sport. Number 1. The brother who died while he ran. James Francis Thorpe was born on May 28, 1887, in a one-room cabin on the banks of the North Canadian River, in what was still Indian Territory, decades before Oklahoma became a state. His mother, Charlotte View, was of Potawatomi and Kickapoo descent, the granddaughter of a chief. His father, Hiram, was of Sac and Fox and Irish blood, a rancher, a fighter, and a man who would eventually have 19 children from 5 different women. Jim was not born alone. He came into the world alongside a twin brother named Charlie. Charlotte gave her firstborn sons a Sac and Fox name, Watho Hook, meaning bright path. The boys were inseparable. They swam the rivers, trapped along the creeks, and rode horses bareback across the Oklahoma prairie before either of them could read a full sentence. When the twins were 6, their father sent them 23 miles away to the Sac and Fox Agency boarding school. The school operated under the philosophy that had defined federal Indian policy for decades: strip the language, cut the hair, erase the culture. Charlie adapted. Jim did not. He ran away repeatedly. But Charlie pulled him through, helping him with his studies, keeping him tethered to a place that felt like a prison. Then, when the boys were about 9 years old, a fever swept through the school. Charlie contracted pneumonia. Jim had run away again, and by the time he came back, his twin brother was gone. His daughter Grace would say years later that Jim believed he had inherited Charlie's strength, that his brother was with him always, but the loss carved something out of him that never grew back. Within a few years, his mother Charlotte died from childbirth complications. His father Hiram, wounded in a hunting accident, died of gangrene. By the age of 16, Jim Thorpe was an orphan, a Native American kid with no parents, no money, and no home. What he did have was a body that could do things no one had ever seen. Number 2. Street clothes and a 5'9" bar. In February 1904, the 16-year-old Thorpe boarded a train for Carlisle, Pennsylvania. The Carlisle Indian Industrial School was founded by a cavalry officer named Richard Henry Pratt, whose guiding philosophy was captured in 5 words that still chill the blood: kill the Indian, save the man. Students were given white names, forbidden from speaking their languages, and trained in trades meant to erase every trace of their heritage. Thorpe arrived angry, grief-stricken, and utterly uninterested in becoming a tailor or a tinsmith. But he had walked onto a campus that worshipped one thing above all else: athletics. And the school's coach, Glenn "Pop" Warner, was building one of the most innovative football programs in the country. The story of how Warner discovered Thorpe has become legend, and unlike many Thorpe legends, this one appears to be true. In 1907, a group of track athletes were practicing the high jump. Thorpe, walking past in his work clothes, stopped to watch. The bar was set at 5 feet 9 inches. On a dare, or perhaps just to prove a point, Thorpe walked up and cleared it in his street clothes. The next day, he was in Warner's office. Within months, he was Carlisle's one-man track team, running sprints, throwing the shot put, clearing hurdles, launching the javelin. He could run the 100-yard dash in 10 seconds flat. He could broad jump 23 feet 6 inches. He had never even picked up a javelin before coming to Carlisle. Warner resisted letting him play football at first. Thorpe was too valuable to risk to injury. But when Thorpe finally got onto the field, he ran through the entire defense on his first carry. He played halfback, kicked field goals, punted, and tackled on defense. He was named a first-team All-American in 1911 and 1912. And he was about to do something that would make the entire world say his name. Number 3. Gold medals in shoes from a trash can. In the summer of 1912, Jim Thorpe sailed across the Atlantic with the United States Olympic team, bound for Stockholm, Sweden. He had never competed in a decathlon. He had barely thrown a javelin, At the qualifying trials, he didn't even know you were allowed a running start for the javelin throw, so he stood still and launched it from a dead stop. He still qualified. What happened in Stockholm was not a victory. It was a demolition. In the pentathlon, 5 events crammed into a single day, Thorpe won 4 of 5, losing only the javelin. He crushed the 1,500-meter run by nearly 5 seconds. Gold medal. Then came the 3-day decathlon, his first ever. Before the second day's events, someone stole his shoes from his bag. Thorpe had minutes to get to the starting line. A teammate lent him one shoe, too small. He found another in a trash can, too big. He stuffed an extra sock into the oversized shoe and walked to the line. Wearing 2 mismatched shoes pulled from a garbage bin and a teammate's bag, Jim Thorpe won the high jump. He won the 110-meter hurdles. He ran the final event, the 1,500 meters, in 4 minutes and 41 seconds. No Olympic decathlete would beat that time until 1970 TWO. His final score of 8,413 points beat the second-place finisher, Sweden's Hugo Wieslander, by 688 points. The margin was so vast it took 4 more Olympics for anyone to surpass it. At the closing ceremony, King Gustav V of Sweden placed 2 gold medals around Thorpe's neck and told him he was the greatest athlete in the world. When Thorpe returned to New York, the city threw him a ticker-tape parade down Broadway. He was 24 years old, a Sac and Fox kid from Indian Territory, and he was the most famous athlete on earth. But what the world gave Jim Thorpe with one hand, it was about to snatch away with the other. Number 4. 22 years after Wounded Knee. Before Stockholm, there was football, and one game above all others tells you what Jim Thorpe meant on a field, and what that field meant to the men who played on it. On November 9, 1912, just 4 months after the Olympics, Carlisle traveled to West Point to face Army. The significance was impossible to miss. It had been only 22 years since the U.S. Army massacred more than 200 Lakota men, women, and children at Wounded Knee. Now, a team of Native American athletes was lining up across from the very institution that had carried out that slaughter. Pop Warner understood the weight of the moment. He told his players before kickoff to remember that it was the fathers and grandfathers of those Army players who had fought their fathers and grandfathers in the Indian Wars. On the other side of the field stood a 21-year-old cadet named Dwight David Eisenhower, 3 decades away from commanding the Allied invasion of Europe, 4 decades from the White House. Eisenhower and his teammates had spent weeks talking about one thing: who would be the man to knock Jim Thorpe out of the game? Nobody knocked Thorpe out of anything. He ran through Army's defense like it was made of paper. He scored 2 touchdowns and kicked 3 goals. Carlisle won 27-6. The New York Tribune called Thorpe's running a revelation, reporting that he ran like a streak through the Army line, scattering tacklers to all sides. Eisenhower himself would later say that Thorpe could do everything anyone else could, but he could do it better. It was the high water mark, the moment when a Native American orphan from Oklahoma stood at the absolute peak of American sport, having conquered the world's Olympic stage and humiliated the nation's military academy on its own field. And it was all about to come crashing down over $15 a week. Number 5. $15 and a stolen crown. In the summers of 1909 and 1910, before the Olympics, Thorpe had played minor league baseball in Rocky Mount, North Carolina. He played first base. He pitched. He earned about $15 a week, pocket money by any standard, a fortune by none. Dozens of college athletes did the same thing under assumed names. Thorpe hadn't bothered with a fake name. He didn't think it mattered. In January 1913, a Massachusetts newspaper published the story. A local coach named Charles Clancy had casually mentioned Thorpe's 2 summers in the Eastern Carolina Association, and a reporter realized what it meant. Thorpe had technically been a professional athlete when he competed in Stockholm. The Amateur Athletic Union moved with stunning speed. Thorpe wrote a letter pleading his case, acknowledging he had played ball, but insisting he hadn't understood the rules. It didn't matter. The AAU stripped his amateur status retroactively. The International Olympic Committee followed, unanimously voting to take back his gold medals, erase his records, and wipe his name from the official books. The silver medalists were upgraded to gold. Here is what makes the injustice burn. The Olympic rulebook stated that any protest had to be filed within 30 days of the closing ceremonies. The newspaper story didn't appear until January 1913, 6 months after Stockholm. By the IOC's own rules, the challenge came too late. They stripped him anyway. Hugo Wielander, the Swedish decathlete bumped to gold, refused to accept the medal. He always maintained that Thorpe was the only legitimate champion. And blocking Thorpe's reinstatement for decades was a man with a personal stake in keeping him erased, Avery Brundage, who had competed against Thorpe in the 1912 pentathlon, finished 6th, and later became president of the IOC. With Thorpe removed from the amateur record, Brundage's own standing improved. He held the IOC presidency from 1952 to 1972 and fought every attempt to restore Thorpe's honors. As one historian put it, if Jim Thorpe had been an upper-class white athlete from Harvard or Princeton, he would never have been sacrificed this way. Number 6. The president nobody remembers. Thorpe's response to having his Olympic legacy erased was characteristically quiet. He refused to campaign for his own reputation. He told his daughter Grace years later that he had won his medals and he knew he had won them, and that was enough. Then he went to work. In 1913, he signed with the New York Giants to play baseball. Manager John McGraw used him primarily as a pinch hitter and part-time outfielder. Thorpe was fast and powerful, but never mastered the curveball. He bounced between the Giants, the Cincinnati Reds, and the Boston Braves over 6 seasons, batting .252 across his career. Baseball was a paycheck, not a calling. Football was different. In 1915, Thorpe joined the Canton Bulldogs for $250 a game, an enormous sum at the time, and led them to 3 professional championships. He could do things on a football field that bordered on the absurd, kicking 40-yard field goals, throwing 60-yard spirals, running through entire defenses, and playing both sides of the ball for a full 60 minutes. In 1920, when a group of team owners met in a car dealership in Canton, Ohio, to form the American Professional Football Association, the organization that would become the NFL, they elected Jim Thorpe as their first president. The title was largely ceremonial, chosen for the fame his name would bring to a fledgling league. But the man who held the job before anyone else, before Pete Rozelle, before Roger Goodell, was a Sac and Fox athlete who had already been stripped of his greatest honors. Away from the field, grief kept finding him. His first wife, Iva Miller, bore 4 children. Their firstborn son, James Jr., died at the age of 3 during the influenza epidemic. The marriage collapsed under the weight of loss and Thorpe's growing struggles with alcohol. He married Frida Kirkpatrick in 1926 and had 4 more sons. That marriage, too, fractured. Football was the one place where the world still made sense, but even football couldn't last forever. Number 7. The greatest athlete digs a ditch. Jim Thorpe played his last professional game in 1929. He was 41 years old. His body was finished, and his timing could not have been worse. The Great Depression hit within months. What followed were 2 decades that read like a cruel joke written by someone who hated athletes. The greatest athlete in the world, voted exactly that by the Associated Press in 1950, spent his post-career digging ditches, working as a bouncer, painting houses, guarding construction sites, and standing in line for day labor. Hollywood gave him work, but only the kind that deepened the insult. Thorpe appeared in roughly 70 films, almost always uncredited, almost always playing a nameless Indian chief in a Western. The great Watho Huck, a man who had been presented gifts by kings and czars, was reduced to a background prop in someone else's story. To his credit, he eventually formed his own casting company to pressure studios into hiring authentic Native American actors. It was ahead of its time. It didn't make him any money. He married a 3rd time in 1945 to Patricia Askew. He briefly joined the Merchant Marine during World War II at age 57. He fought the federal government to reclaim land for the Sac and Fox tribe, funding the effort with public speaking appearances. But the alcoholism that had shadowed him for years was now consuming him. The man who could once run 100 yards in 10 seconds flat could barely keep a job for more than a few months. In 1951, Warner Brothers released a movie about his life, Jim Thorpe, All-American, starring Burt Lancaster. The film had a happy ending. Jim Thorpe's actual life did not. Number 8. The champion who couldn't pay his bill. In 1950, Jim Thorpe was hospitalized in Philadelphia for lip cancer. He had no insurance. He had no savings. He was admitted as a charity case, a man whose name was known on 5 continents checking into a hospital because he couldn't afford to check himself in. At a press conference announcing the procedure, his wife Patricia stood before reporters and wept. Her words landed like a fist. "We're broke," she said. "Jim has nothing but his name and his memories. He has spent money on his own people and has given it away. He has often been exploited." Think about that for a moment. The man the Associated Press had just voted the greatest athlete of the first half of the 20th century, ahead of Babe Ruth, ahead of Jesse Owens, ahead of every boxer, swimmer, and ball player who ever lived, was lying in a hospital bed with someone else paying his bill. His Olympic medals were gone. His records were erased. His body was broken from decades of football, baseball, and labor. And his country, the country whose flag he had carried in Stockholm, the country whose anthem had played when they hung gold around his neck, had nothing for him but a charity ward. He survived the surgery. He went home to a trailer in Loma, California with Patricia, clinging to what remained. And what remained was not much: a body in decline, a name the world was beginning to forget, and a growing certainty that the bright path his mother had named him for had led somewhere very dark. Number 9. A body for a town's name. On March 28, 1953, Jim Thorpe sat down to dinner with Patricia in their home in Lomita. He went into cardiac arrest, his 3rd heart attack. He was briefly revived by artificial respiration. He spoke to the people around him. Then he lost consciousness and died. He was 64 years old. What happened next is one of the strangest stories in American history. Oklahoma planned a memorial. The governor's office discussed a monument in Shawnee. Citizens raised money. They paid for Patricia and one of Thorpe's sons to travel from California with the body. They arranged a funeral service and mausoleum costs. Then the governor vetoed a bill to fund the memorial, and the whole plan stalled. Patricia was furious. She feared Jim would end up in an unmarked grave. When she learned that 2 small Pennsylvania towns, Mauch-Chunk and East Mauch-Chunk, struggling former coal towns desperate for tourism, were looking for something to put themselves on the map, she saw an opportunity. The deal she struck was remarkable and, to Thorpe's other children, unforgivable. Patricia had Jim's body removed from Oklahoma and shipped east. The 2 towns agreed to merge, rename the combined municipality Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania, and build a monument with his remains. In exchange, they got a famous name on a welcome sign and a tourist attraction. Jim Thorpe had never visited these towns. He had never set foot in the borough. He had no connection to northeastern Pennsylvania beyond the 100 miles that separated Mauch-Chunk from the Carlisle School, where he had once been told to forget he was an Indian. His sons, Jack, Bill, and Richard, spent decades trying to bring their father home. In 2010, Jack filed a federal lawsuit under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. A judge initially ruled in the family's favor, but an appeals court reversed the decision, and in 2015, the Supreme Court refused to hear the case. Jack Thorpe died during the litigation, at 73, without ever seeing his father return to Oklahoma soil. Jim Thorpe's body remains in Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania, to this day. Number 10. 110 years to say his name. For nearly 7 decades after his death, the record books carried a lie. Jim Thorpe was listed, at best, as a co-champion of the 1912 Olympic pentathlon and decathlon, sharing gold with men who had never wanted it. Hugo Wiesland refused his medal for his entire life. Ferdinand B. never accepted his. Both men always said the same thing: Jim Thorpe was the only champion. The original medals were placed in museums. Both were stolen, neither has ever been recovered. In 1983, the IOC finally returned replica gold medals to Thorpe's children, Gail and Bill, in a ceremony 30 years after his death. But they stopped short of restoring his records, listing him only as co-winner, a half measure that satisfied no one. The full reckoning took until July 15, 2022, 110 years to the day after Thorpe won the decathlon gold in Stockholm. The nonprofit Bright Path Strong, named after Thorpe's Sac and Fox name, gathered more than 75,000 signatures and the support of tribal nations across the country. The IOC voted to reinstate Jim Thorpe as the sole winner of both events. Not co-champion, not a footnote, the sole gold medalist. Wieslander's surviving family confirmed what he had always believed, that Thorpe was the only legitimate champion, and the Sac and Fox Nation added Olympic rings to their official flag in his honor. Today, in that quiet town in northeastern Pennsylvania, Jim Thorpe's body still lies beneath two granite statues and a mound of red Oklahoma soil. Soil carried 700 miles from the land where he was born, mixed with earth from the Stockholm stadium where he won his medals in mismatched shoes pulled from a trash can. A Sac and Fox orphan who lost his twin brother at 9, lost his parents by 16, lost his medals to a rule his accusers didn't even follow, lost his money, lost his health, and lost his right to rest in his own homeland. And still, he is the greatest athlete this country has ever produced. They took everything from Jim Thorpe, everything except the truth. If you think Jim Thorpe's story deserves to be told, and that the men who built this game deserve to be remembered, consider subscribing. If you believe his body belongs in Oklahoma, tell us in the comments.